Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I speak with the novelist Lev Grossman. I've been a fan of Lev's novels for a long time. He is the author of, among other books, The Magician's Trilogy, a splendid set of books about a university for magic, fantastical worlds, and much, much more. These books are amazing. Lev's newest book is the novel The Bright Sword, a sort of retelling of the legends of King Arthur, particularly what happens after Arthur dies. I devoured The Bright Sword and found it fascinating. It's a book that weaves together ideas about gods and magic, the layering of myths across history, and much more, all of which I wanted to speak with Lev about. Lev and I had a chance to discuss the story of King Arthur, its gaps in its history, the layering of gods and stories over time, the nature of magic and religion, the importance of secondary worlds, and the magic in the magicians versus the magic of the bright sword. We even had a chance to discuss Lev's next project, which is a space opera. This was a lot of fun. Let's jump in. Lev, so great to chat with you. Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Thank you
Your
so
new
much.
novel, thank you. This is great. Your new novel, The Bright Sword, it's wonderful. It's similar in some ways to your previous novels, but also quite different. I think it would be fun to kind of start with like what led you to this story of, I don't know, the misfits or the dregs of the round table, or however we want to describe it. It's so almost like a kind of post-credit story of the King Arthur world. I'd love to kind of hear what led you to that.
Yeah, sure. First of all, you said what every novelist longs to hear, which is that it's similar but different. That's what everybody aims for in their next novel.
You succeeded.
In terms of what led me there, like many people, I was quite obsessed with Arthur when I was younger. I came in through The Once and Future King. And for most of my life, I considered the Arthur story to be a story that had already been told, that T.H. White had told it in a definitive way. Any little scraps that he might have left lying around had been picked up by Marion Zimmer Bradley, Mary Stuart, Bernard Cornwell, and we were done. That was a wrap on King Arthur. But the Arthur story, it has a very singular quality, which is unlike almost any narrative that I think that lives in our culture, which is that although we have been telling it for a very long time, the Arthur story is older than I realized before I became a serious Arthurian nerd. The earliest traces of it or tellings of it come from possibly as early as the 7th century. So we're talking 1200, 1300 years. The Arthur story, it has a way of changing its meaning over time. Bones of it remain the same, but it becomes about different things. It becomes about kingship. It becomes about, originally, I think it was a kind of resistance anthem of the Welsh who were trying to keep the Saxons out. I think for T.H. White, it was probably about the specter of world war, since he wrote it in the mid-20th century. For Marion Zimmer Bradley, obviously, it was about feminism and neo-paganism. Every age gets the Arthur that it needs. It was not apparent to me that we had the Arthur that we needed yet. I felt as though King Arthur must surely have something to say to us, but he hadn't said it yet. And the question was how to tell that story in such a way that he says it. And I was very slow to arrive at that idea, but probably some of it, if I'm being honest, came from Game of Thrones. The engine of that story, or the thing that sort of kicks it off, is the death of the king, or perhaps two kings, but probably Robert Baratheon. The whole story is an extended succession crisis. I began to play with the idea of what would a story look like if the king who died wasn't Robert Baratheon, it was King Arthur. And when I did that, a whole lot of lights lit up. And I realized there was something very interesting there. It's a basic convention of the Arthurian story that the story ends with Arthur's death. When you read Thomas Malory, for example, The Mort d'Arthur, the label says what's in the tin. Arthur will die, and then the story, everyone will grieve because it's a great tragedy, and the story will end. So I became very curious about what would happen if you left the cameras rolling, as it were. You know, what White's great stroke of genius, or one of them, was the idea of telling the story of Arthur's childhood. Nobody had ever done that before. All that stuff about Arthur being tutored by Merlin, but White, he just made it up out of whole cloth. And he gave us Arthur as a young boy, which we'd never had before. He discovered this vast tract of land on the map that had never been explored. And the time after Arthur's death was similarly unexplored. There was very little writing about it. And I realized that you could do something very interesting there. And I realized also you could do something very, very modern there. Something about that story, about that world that Arthur leaves behind, where the center has not held, the pillar that held everything up has collapsed. And we're left in the darkness with this kind of broken kingdom, and the institutions and the stars that we used to steer by are gone. When I looked at that world, I recognized it. It felt like the world that we're living in now. And I thought maybe that's the Arthur that we need. That's the Arthur I've been looking for.
That's that is an amazing description. Related to kind of that, the world of kind of loss, like you're kind of describing, is almost this like this modern world. In what sense would you describe that? Because like on the one hand, I can think about people talking about like the ideas of like disenchantment, but obviously this world is still very much enchanted. There's lots of religions, there's layers of gods and things like that, but there still is this sense of loss versus kind of modernity, which has certain aspects of like, okay, when there's disenchantment, we can no longer believe these things, or it's only one among a suite of different ideas. How do you kind of think about like, that specific kind of loss and its parallels kind of in the modern world?
Well, I think in part, and now I'm going to start speaking in cliches.
That's fine.
It's a loss of it's the loss of the institutions that we trust. That's a cliche, but it's probably true. The level of trust in public institutions right now is very, very low, and I think something similar happens when Arthur dies. The entire faith of a kingdom was sort of pinned on him, and what we discover late in his reign, when Mordred rebels against him, as in fact. People didn't even trust him in that way that we thought that they did. And in fact, it was once he was pushed, he fell very easily. There's something very recognizable about that. And in a way, the world it is and it isn't enchanted the way that it once was. Something that happens in the Arthur myth, and this is not something that I made up. It happens in Thomas Malory and most versions of it, is that after the quest for the Holy Grail, God withdraws from Britain. Up until that time, God is very present in the Arthur story. There's never a question whether the knights believe in God, because God is always sticking his oar in. He's always sending miracles and marvels. He takes a rooting interest in battles and even individual sword fights. He sends them adventures and quests. After the quest for the Holy Grail, he ceases to do that. This is made quite explicit in the stories. There are no more adventures after that, and God doesn't speak to them in that way that he did before. So although, there's still enchantment, Morgan Le Fay's spells still work the way they used to, God has gone very far away. He's taken the Grail with him. He's taken Galahad with him. And he no longer guides them. He no longer chooses them when he has a quest to do. And so in some ways, they feel as though the world that they're in, it still has the magical, but it lacks the divine. And for them, it's everything. They no longer have that to strive for. They don't go on quests anymore. They just do tournaments. They just play games, essentially. And it doesn't mean what it did anymore. And to me, there was something that I saw in that. It spoke to me. And I feel like it speaks to this moment that we are in history.
That's really interesting. Yeah, this kind of moment of loss, or kind of hiding of certain things that we kind of had taken for granted or assumed are there and kind of are no longer there. Related to, I guess, gods and magic and kind of all those different ideas. On the one hand, there's, as you mentioned, kind of this idea of like the divine has hidden itself post the Grail. On the other hand, there's this kind of layering of gods that you kind of that you explore and try to make explicit, where there's kind of the old ones are kind of the old gods. Then there's I guess the gods of the Romans, and then eventually kind of the one god of later Rome, which parallels a lot of just sort of the layering of different peoples in the British Isles, people moving over and over and over. How do you think about that layering, that sort of, I don't know, syncretic kind of approach of different ideas? And you explore this kind of in the book, but how did you think about that when you were writing, as well as kind of how should it speak to us as modern people?
You're hitting on something extremely important, which actually I probably should have mentioned earlier. Something that I noticed about Arthur, in some ways, The Bright Sword it's a very traditional Arthur book, in that we counter all the favorite tropes. I'm an Arthur fanboy myself, so we needed to have a sword and a stone. We need to have the quest for the Grail, Lady of the Lake. All that stuff has to turn up. But something that when I reread the story, something resonated for me that I hadn't seen a lot of earlier stories deal with, and that's the fact that Arthur is living in what we would call now a post-colonial nation. Rome has occupied Britain for 350 years. They leave around 410. And then historically, to the extent that we think historically about Arthur would have turned up around the turn of around the beginning of the 500s, the 6th century, when Britain is still grappling with the trauma of this historical violence, of having been occupied by Rome for so long, and its indigenous culture suppressed. And interestingly, Arthur is what we would think of as on the wrong side of that particular history, in that he is a Romanized Briton. He has one of the Britons who's part of the upper crust. He's taken on the ways of the occupiers. He still speaks Latin, even though the Romans are long gone. Again, this is our historical theory about who Arthur would have been. And so there is that interesting sense of layering and division within this kingdom of Britain. But I also became interested in the story of Arthur. Something that I think people take up Arthur for now has to do with this idea of nationhood. This idea, the people who are here now in this country have always been there. They have a right to this nation. We have to keep that nation pure and undivided, untainted by outsiders. And it's something to some extent that's built into the Arthur story. The earliest versions of Arthur are about a warlord trying to keep the Saxons out, trying to keep Britain, as it were, for the Britons. And of course, he fails. He can't do that. And the kingdom that results is a much more mixed kingdom. It's the Britain that we know today, with all those filthy Anglo-Saxons in it, as well as a lot of Celts and many people from many other parts of the world. But there's something about that dream of a pure nation, which is very, frankly, Trumpian, that clings to King Arthur. And so something I wanted to make clear and make part of it was that it is a layered kingdom. It would be a good way of putting it. Another way is that it's a very impure kingdom. I actually make a point that the Druids, who were the sort of priest kings of the Celts, when they looked at Stonehenge and the stone circles, they had no idea what those things meant. No more idea than we did, because the Druids didn't build Stonehenge. The people from whom the Celts took Britain, when they arrived, those are the people who built Stonehenge. The Stonehenge is actually evidence of an even earlier layer that comes before the Celts.
Wow.
And who knows how many layers there are below that. So there's something about that sense of depth and complexity of history that I tried to bake into the world of the Bright Sword, because it seemed very important. And again, something we're very, very aware of now when we try, when I say we, I mean Americans really, are trying to be a whole country, and yet feel divided against each other.
That's really interesting. And I think right alongside kind of, recognizing the consistent layering and kind of, all this constant mixing and kind of the way that this has always been, right, there's also just this sense of immense time. You mentioned this with, Stonehenge was already there when the Celts began to kind of do their thing, and they had to kind of reappropriate and kind of understand it. This reminds me of, I think there's some fact to the effect of that we were actually modern us are closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the pyramids, the construction of the pyramids. And so just recognizing that there are these vast swaths of time, and they all kind of play together in this kind of interesting way. And I wonder if there's something there in terms of the Arthur stories, in the same way that the Arthur stories play on this layering, that the stories themselves have constantly been reinterpreted over and over and over. And there's the layering of the stories themselves that also is kind of part of this reinterpretation, kind of.
Wow, absolutely. I think it's
of history.
Sorry, I talked over you, but I think it's part of the strength of the Arthur story. And this is something that fascinates me. The Arthur that we know, mostly the kind of high medieval version of Arthur that was written by people like Mallory and Chrétien de Troyes and people like that. When they wrote it, it is set in the 6th century. They knew enough to know that Arthur was that old, but they gave him all the trappings of the contemporary world, because that happened to be how they wrote historical fiction back in that time. So Arthur, who we think of, the Arthur we know, is a mashup. He's a combination of sort of 12th, 13th, 14th century Britain with 6th century Britain, and as such, highly problematic for historical novelists, because he is a creature of anachronisms, and he has braided into him, all these little traces of different parts of history. He's a very Christian figure, but also a very pagan figure. There's something, as you say, syncretic about Arthur, which is. When you don't realize when you first glance at him, because you just see the top layer. But it's one of the things I think that makes the story so strong and enduring, is the way that it has been sort of deposited over time and taken into itself these different elements. That moment, which is iconic, where Bedivere returns Excalibur to the water after Arthur's death. or I guess right before Arthur's death, hurls it into the water, and the lady of the lake reaches up and catches it and draws it below the surface. That is a very, very old trope. It is older than the Romans. It is an Iron Age trope. This idea of retiring weapon in the waters, and it had survived for centuries, for certainly more than 1,000 years, and then resurfaced in the Arthur story when it was added to it in the, I'm going to get it wrong, but probably the 12th to 13th century. And you realize how powerful these tropes are and how the whole thing is melted together out of them. It's really quite wonderful.
Yeah, and this, I guess, to a certain degree, it also gives you like the freedom to say, okay, which version is the correct Arthur? Is this one? Is that one? The answer is yes, they all are, because they're kind of this constant reimagining. On the other hand, though, and you mentioned like, and there are these tropes and these features that have kind of been around and repurposed for the Arthur story. I mean, if you look at, I think, like the Cinderella story, it's been around for like hundreds, if not thousands of years, I believe, at least in various versions. When you were thinking about using, or I guess telling your version of the Arthur story, did the fact that there is this layering of historical components to it, did that make it easier to do the research in some way? Because you could, on the one hand, say, okay, because there's so many different versions, there's so many different time periods, anything goes. On the other hand, though, I think people probably subconsciously have a sense of like what is Arthurian, but it's one of those like we know it when we see it kind of thing, and they can only tell you it's wrong versus what is right. And was that kind of the way you approached the research and how to think about all this?
Well, the research was a pain, frankly. No, I don't mean to complain about Arthur, but this book took me almost 10 years to write. And one of the reasons was because for a fantasy novel, it does contain a hell of a lot of fact. But the facts are to paraphrase William Gibson, not evenly distributed. The past is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so because Arthur, he exists in the sort of two periods at once. The period in which his story was really codified, the medieval period. And so it's very important to know all about that. But then, of course, there's this stony bedrock of Dark Ages Britain, where he was truly sort of engendered. And you have to know all about that as well. And then you have to decide which part of those two pictures you want to include. And then there's all the stuff in between, like Sir Palomides. Palomides was a Muslim. He cannot actually have been in 6th century Britain because Islam did not begin as a religion until after that. But he's a beloved and canonical part of the story, and frankly, really, really interesting to me as a character. And so I needed to put him in there, even though he was an anachronistic. And he comes from Golden Age Baghdad, which is all wrong, but that it doesn't fit with Dark Ages Britain. But there you go. In a way, it's a candy store in that you can take whatever you like, but you have to make it all fit together and then plaster over the cracks so nobody can see.
Were there any particular like mythical tropes, like in the same way you mentioned, kind of like returning a weapon to the water? Like, were there any tropes that you were aware of that hadn't been incorporated into the Arthur stories that you felt were worth including just because of their being like hallowed by time?
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, not on the face of it. I chuck in a dragon, which is not a particularly Arthurian thing, but I think I'd have my fantasy novelist card revoked by the guild if I did not include a dragon in my story. But what I really found was I found myself sort of combining tropes in a way that I hoped was what was new and interesting. For example, the Arthurian world does have that strange quality that it has two flavors of the supernatural in it. It has the divine in it. It has angels are always turning up and God is sending miracles, but then it also has the magical in it, the kind of indigenous supernatural tradition of Britain. And ordinarily, these two things dance around each other. And when one enters, the other one leaves. And so you don't have to deal with the inconsistencies between them. But when I started The Bright Sword, I swore a mighty oath that I would have a fairy in a big fight with an angel because A, it was so cool, and B, you have to decide which rules do you want to abide by and which to break. And one rule of the Arthurian tradition is that no one's supposed to talk about the fact that we have fairies and angels in the same story, even though they don't really belong there. And I thought, no, these two, they've danced around each other for long enough. Let's put them in the octagon and have them square off, because there's something exciting about bringing together tropes that don't belong together.
And I think you see this a little bit in your magician's novels as well. This idea that gods and religion and magic, they're not distinct. There's kind of this continuum of these supernatural powers and kind of how people think about them, how you can call upon them. I guess a little bit more in terms of like the Bright Sword. How did you think about that? And in addition to kind of making the entire book as a way of getting the fairy and the angel have this kind of giant smackdown. Was there? I mean, how did you kind of think about like magic and gods, and in terms of like, were there any sort of like larger kind of rule sets for how you thought about this, or was it more just kind of the things that felt true to the story that you wanted to pursue?
But it's tricky, and it goes to that syncretic quality of the Arthur story, because in truth, the rule sets are not wholly compatible. It's like trying to play, I don't know, D&D and Warhammer at the same time. You know, in the Celtic world, who created the world? Who created the cosmos? Well, nobody knows. The Celts don't tell that story. It's understood, I think, to be forgotten in time. But of course, in the Christian tradition, it's God who created the world. So did God create the Celtic gods as well? But why would he do that? So there's a little bit of hand waving that goes on. Mostly, you have to sort of you almost have to adopt a pagan mindset. You know, the pagans were actually quite welcoming to Jesus as a deity. They all thought, fantastic. I think this Jesus fellow you've got sounds fantastic. It's great. We'll sacrifice to him. Absolutely. Absolutely will. Just give us a little bit of that magical bread that you guys are always waving around, and everything's going to be cool. The Christian, it was a relatively new idea that there could only be one God, and it's an idea popularized by Christianity. But there's something quite wonderful and rich about this pagan world in which all the myths are true. Nobody is wrong, and you choose which one you like, and you don't try to get too persnickety or legalistic about who exactly created the world. So I try to approach it from a pagan point of view, which is to sell Christianity a little bit short, of course, because the idea of goodness, the idea of virtue, which is not really well organized in pagan traditions. Say this for Christianity, it organized it pretty good, and that of course is that idea of goodness, that ideal, no, that chivalric ideal, that Christian ideal. It's what makes Arthur special, and it's what haunts his days and nights. There's no story without the Christian God. He wouldn't be the Arthur that we know. So again, you can't. There's no point. There's no piece of the puzzle you can lift out without the rest of it falling apart.
That's really interesting. And then I guess there's a term. I think it's monolatry, where it's like basically rather than monotheism of like there is only one God. It's where there are many gods, but you're only supposed to be worshiping that one God. And I feel like there is actually some interesting power in using that kind of approach with King Arthur, where there is this constant tension of, okay, there are all these other things kind of in the pagan world, but I have to keep on being true to this God, to the Roman God or the Christian God. And then but there's also this idea that you mentioned, like virtue, and so it's less about just the gods and which ones we kind of pick and choose, and more about what are the ideals that kind of fall out from the different beliefs and gods that you kind of choose to latch onto, I guess. But
yeah, I think that's very accurate. Something that I try to adopt going in is that everybody's beliefs are true, and it's all real. And so the pagan god's real, and the Christian God is real, and nobody is wrong. So everybody else is going to have to fight it out to see who's going to win. It's sort of Game of Thrones up there as much as it is Game of Thrones down here.
That's a really good take on that. It also, it makes it more compelling. Of okay, if everything is true, then how do people choose? What is there's a lot of strife and tension there. Moving to your magician's novels, but staying on the topic of kind of the world of magic. The world, the world, or I guess the topic of magic in the magician's novels, it's not quite a rule set, but it's much more clearly, I guess, laid out in the sense that magic is not this thing that is particularly easy. It requires a lot of, and there's craft, there's work. Yeah. You have to go to school to learn these things, or you have to spend a lot of time learning this. Did any of those ideas kind of seep into The Bright Sword, or was kind of the idea of magic very distinct in terms of how you thought about the magician's novels?
Well, it's interesting because I can remember coming to the bits where magic is to be worked and thinking, well, at least there won't be a learning curve for me here because I already know how this is done. I wrote 3 books of it. But of course, when you dig into the pagan tradition of magic, especially the Celtic one, you realize that it's running off a bit of different power grid than, for example, Harry Potter or the magicians. In that, when the Druids did magic, I think there was some spell casting. I think that there was some wand waving and so on and so forth. Staffs, I suppose they had staves. But a lot of the magic that was done was of a kind of transactional nature. The world was absolutely full of spirits and gods. When the Druids looked around and they saw a big boulder Well, there's a spirit associated with the boulder and with the mountain over there, and that with that unusually large tree that also has a god associated with it. So there's this wonderful populated landscape. And when you needed supernatural work done, it was often a matter of negotiating with different spirits. Fortunately, I've been sacrificing to the spirit of the boulder for some years now, and so he owes me a solid. And so he'll take care of this. He'll make sure that the crops thrive or whatever it is. So what I realized is that it was much more of this sort of connected web of relationships that structured and characterized the magical world for the Celts and for the Druids, which was and of course, Merlin was a druid, something that was pointed out to me by C.S. Lewis. Merlin was, of course, a druid. And so that was the kind of magic that he practiced. And so it was in some ways very different from the magic of the magicians, which was much more abstract. It's much more part of that modern fantasy tradition, which we know and love. But it was really the rule set, as you say, was quite different. And annoyingly, I had to relearn how to write about magic for the Bright Sword.
That's interesting. Yeah, and it also when I think about the world of magic and in the magicians and kind of how it operates, it reminds me a lot more of like how, and maybe this is kind of my hat of like kind of like my computer science background. It felt much more about like learning the craft of coding and things like that, which I actually have written a little bit about this kind of stuff versus what in the Bright Sword, where it's much more rather than learning a craft or a skill or computer programming or whatever it is. It's much more around building relationships and getting to know people and kind of understand and almost kind of being really good at networking.
It's a real social media.
Right, or like sales. It's like working in sales, but for the spiritual realm.
But it's not.
That's really interesting.
It's not particularly human-centered, and I think that's because this is a hobby horse of mine. I think that's because in many ways that modern fantasy tradition that we talk about has developed as a reaction to or as a way of understanding technology. I think that a lot of the things that magic does in books like Harry Potter or The Magicians or a million other books, it takes over many of the functions of technology, but it does them in a way that is very different somehow. That it endows them with the kind of aura and a meaning that we don't find in technology, not to rubbish technology. But I think that one of the reasons that fantasy literature is so popular right now, and it has absolutely exploded in the past 20 or 30 years, is the same reason that it became popular or became important for Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, in that we are in the aftermath of a technological revolution, and we are still trying to catch up within ourselves with the consequences of what we have done to ourselves as a civilization. And I think that thinking about magic, telling stories about magic, is a way of trying to understand where we've come to in our history.
Do you think that's also related to the idea of like enchantment and disenchantment, where it's because of the technological realm that has controlled so many of the things around us, we feel maybe certain aspects of disenchantment, however we want to define that term. And as a result, rather than re-enchanting the world and kind of beginning to believe nonsense, we instead tell stories that help us make things feel more real in the world, and fantasy is kind of the embodiment of that.
I think that's very fair. I think it's very fair. A truism among certainly fantasy novelists, but also historians who write about this kind of thing is the world. Once the world has been disenchanted, it can never be re-enchanted in the same way. And I think that we, when we talk about magic, we don't talk about it the way they did in ancient times, or even many of us, I think, talk about religion in the same way that we used to. So we're searching for new ways to enchant the world and make it feel and find a relationship with it that feels, meaningful to us. And I think we're still casting about for it. But I think reading Brandon Sanderson, we're still reading Tolkien. Tolkien still works. His magic still works. Is a way that we are having to try to think about a relationship to it, to make it not feel sort of, cold, empty, fungible. I don't know.
Well, and even in your magician's novel, there's kind of the sense, and some of the characters, they learn magic. They think this will kind of fill that meaning gap or whatever it is, and they're not really satisfied. They kind of realize that they're still the same people. They just now have a lot more powers related to that, though. And one of and I guess the difference is when they kind of move to your more kind of magical world of Fillory, that's when they begin to feel a certain kind of larger set of stakes. Like, do you think we almost that people almost need these secondary worlds as a place, like that's where the meaning resides, whether it's Middle Earth or Fillory or whatever it is?
Yes, I think that's true. I think there's something about our world which even novelists can't endow it with meaning the way that it used to have. But something that we see, and I think It's a very interesting trope, is when characters go into a secondary world like Fillory or even Narnia. Once they get there, meaning is not as stable there as they had hoped. This, as it were, fantasy of another world where that's full of meaning, and where you can't really feel that despair, that lostness that I'm sort of trying to get at in the Bright Sword. Um, even in the novels, it tends to be not as true as you want it to, and you tend to bring your problems with you to the secondary world, and you have to find a way to solve them all over again.
Do you think that's just due to the fact that, I mean, people are people, and we kind of we're always searching for what we don't have? Or I imagine there are certain less realistic fantasy novels where people have whatever they need, or these worlds are imbued with as much meaning as we might require. That doesn't feel that realistic. I mean, an equivalent, and this is more moving to the science fiction world, is like in the world of Star Trek and the Federation. One of the things that people will sometimes say is like the most unrealistic thing of these stories is not warp drive or certain replicators or whatever it is. It's the fact that human nature has almost shifted, where people no longer are acquisitive in quite the same way. They kind of just want to better themselves, and there's no need for money or certain things. And it's almost like they've kind of moved. There is a post-scarcity society, but humans have adapted to it in a way that maybe is aspirational, but sometimes maybe even a little bit less realistic. And I wonder if, whether it's fantasy or science fiction, there's a certain cleaving there, where certain novels and stories take human nature as given. Like this is how we are, and we're not necessarily going to change, and we have to recognize that, versus saying, no, if we kind of just smooth out our edges, then everything will be good. But yeah, that maybe is an abandonment of humanity.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, true utopias are very rare, even in fiction, and partly because it's difficult to tell interesting
stories.
They're
boring.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. If you look at Ian Banks, the culture novels, where technology is
right. It's always at the edge of the culture novels, right?
Yes, but even in Narnia, and this used to absolutely haunt me as a child, the fact that in The Last Battle, the last book of the series, much maligned, although I happen to love The Last Battle, Narnia itself collapses. This world that they went to, that they discovered, that was where the meaning was. That's where everything was good, and yet it falls apart, and they are forced to retreat further up and further in, as Aslan says, into Aslan's land, which in some ways was a happy, satisfying ending. But it left me thinking, when I was done, how long before Aslan's land collapses and we'll have to go somewhere else? And you imagine the Pevensey is just retreating from one collapsing utopia to another for the rest of time. It's difficult. It's surprisingly difficult to, even for a genius like C.S. Lewis, to imagine a utopia which is perfect and stable forever.
That's interesting. And I would say the part that haunted me of The Last Battle was the fact that everyone dies, and we kind of don't even note that fact. That was the thing that kind of just seemed very strange.
Yeah.
But it related to kind of these secondary worlds. Going back to Fillory, when you created Fillory and developed it, what was the process there? Was it kind of taking bits and pieces of these other secondary worlds and kind of making them work the way you thought they should? Was it in service of the specific story? I imagine it's a combination of all the different things, but kind of what was the process there?
When I wrote about Fillory, to be completely frank, I imagined myself that I was writing a letter to C.S. Lewis. And what I felt that I was doing in my arrogance was trying to surface aspects of the Narnia world that to me didn't fully make sense. Like Aslan's place in it, for example. Aslan, I could never understand why Aslan didn't work harder as God King of Narnia to make things better for his subjects. His subjects would always be fighting and killing each other, and he would be sort of, wandering around in the woods, flirting with Lucy, and would show up at the, not even at the very last minute, like a little bit too late for everybody to come out with okay. And I suppose you could blame it on the deeper magic, but always that problem, the familiar problem of the existence of evil, it frustrated me, and I tried to push it to a further extreme in the Fillory story. That, along with the basic lack of an economy or ecology, and the presence of Santa Claus. C.S. Lewis, terrible world builder, absolutely terrible. I find it interesting to pick at the seams of Narnia and try to undo them a little bit. And once I'd undone them enough, there was Fillory.
Okay. Related to that, though, I mean, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine about the extent to which, like, when you build these worlds or kind of or when you're telling stories, whether or not things not fully adding up makes them more realistic. And because in the way that the real world is kind of messy, there's always things that are never quite explained. And so it was, I think we were discussing where I think he had written about like Tom Bombadil and Tolkien, and kind of just like this weird thing that's kind of out of left field. And like, there's ways of making it all kind of make sense, but it just kind of seems a little bit different. And there are other, and I think Santa Claus is probably a little too different for Narnia. But do you think there's something that, and I think the example that I was mentioning was I think it was something from Neil Stephenson about so like you look like the periodic table. It's kind of, there's order, but it's also kind of messy. And the equivalent would be like the pantheon of the Greek gods, where there's kind of some order, but then there's also ones that don't really make sense, and there's some that are kind of, I don't know, half human, half god. It's kind of all weird and kind of messy, and like that, and it allows us to make things feel a little realistic, like a little bit more realistic, because we know the world is messy. Did you kind of think about anything there of like, how do you balance order and disorder and regularity and messiness?
Oh, it's absolutely true. I mean, I'm working on something new, which I'm actually doing with a collaborator. And periodically we'll be looking at one of the systems we put in place, and we'll stop and we'll think, no, there has to be one that doesn't make sense. And so we'll build in an exception too. Which just breaks the whole thing, but you just don't look at it too closely, because if you don't, it doesn't feel real. And the paradigm that I use in the magician's books is of language, which of course it's system-like. We impose order upon it retroactively with declensions and conjugations and all that stuff. But the exceptions almost outnumber the rules, and that's how you know that's how you know that you're dealing with a world that feels properly real, is because it's frayed at the edges. Even Tolkien, who was an absolute fiend for order and for completion, probably never been a more rigorous builder than Tolkien. Exactly. He has to have Tom Bombadil in there. One of my favorite moments in The Lord of the Rings is when Tom Bombadil puts on the ring of power, and nothing happens.
Nothing.
You realize he's outside that order that governs the whole rest of the universe. And of course, Tom Bombadil, he is irritating with all his poetry. He talks too much, and he doesn't really advance the plot all that much. But he is that one piece that doesn't quite fit, that makes the rest of it feel real.
You need a certain amount of exceptions to the rule to kind of make it feel realistic. And I view this almost as like should it be like physics, where you have like a few equations that explains everything, or like biology, where there's kind of some general rules, we understand evolution, but it's really squishy and messy, and that kind of makes it feel that much more lived in, so to speak.
Yeah.
So are you able to share anything about this new project, or is that still far too early?
It's not really. It's late enough that I should be able to talk about it coherently, although I haven't very much. I'm actually very interested in science fiction and space opera. I was probably more of a science fiction fan when I took up writing fantasy than I was a fantasy fan. And I've always wanted to get my claws into it. So I'm working on a space opera, probably in the Star Wars tradition.
Okay.
Star Wars, I grew up on it. It's one of my basic loves in my life. And yet, as a franchise, it is showing some age and some cracking around the edges. That basic opposition between light and dark, I think storytellers are struggling to wring complexity out of it when it has this very basic young adult 1970s foundation. And so a friend of mine and I are working on, it'll actually be a graphic novel, not a conventional novel, a Star Wars-like space opera, but something that's built much more on a contemporary chassis, something much more Game of Thrones-like, in the sense that there are many, many factions. There are many shades of gray. It's not really light versus dark, and whatever passes for force or the supernatural, it's much more disorderly even than the force. And in fact, you have competing systems of supernaturalness, just as you have in King Arthur. And it's not really clear, which of them is paramount, and which of them represents the sort of true worldview. Just that messiness, that complexity. I feel like it'd be quite interesting to bring that to a story, a space opera type story, which is space opera tends to be very fantasy-like. It's on the fantasy end of science fiction. It tends to tell those hero's journey kind of stories, which I love. So that is something that I have in progress, that hopefully will be interesting. Although, as it turns out, it takes a very long time to produce a fantasy novel, a graphic novel, because somebody has to draw it. So probably it won't see the light of day for a few more years.
Well, it sounds fantastic. Yeah, and you mentioned we're talking about the Ian Banks's culture novels. Are there any of those kinds of influences as well, or is there kind of much more kind of the Star Wars, like that kind of space opera?
Ian Banks it's not that he's unsung, but I still think he's undersung. What a titanic
His work is
figure.
fantastic, yeah.
Yes, and it's a big influence on me. That thing that he does in working with, I don't know of any technological universe that is higher tech than the culture. I mean, people, they can do just about everything with technology. And I don't know how he kept all this plate spinning, because it's so complex and interesting. So in terms of the messiness of that world, it's certainly an influence, and the humor of it, which I appreciate a lot. He's certainly an influence there, but I think that the technology of this world it'll have that industrial quality that the technology of Star Wars has. It's got that very used universe feel to it, in that all the technology, it's very old and creaky, and it gets the job done just about, but not without a lot of sort of shaking and rattling along the way.
And I think one of the other features of the culture novels, and going back to kind of what we were discussing earlier with and kind of an absence of meaning or a sense of loss, is the culture novels, there's not these larger purposes that the super intelligent minds are working towards. They're kind of having as much fun as they can in this weird, insensitive universe. And it could be a very bleak point, but it actually seems quite playful. Is there anything like that in this kind of world, or is the competing faction are there competing points of meaning that they're trying to argue over?
Oh, I think in that sense, it's much more Banksian. I don't think, one thing I could probably never be accused of is writing a novel of ideas. Everyone's sort of down there in the mud trying to make sense of things, but the sense that they make never really makes that much sense. And even the beings of a higher order are still, they've kind of hit the ceiling of their ability to make sense of anything. And as you say, they're just trying to have a decent time.
Well, sounds amazing. That might be a perfect place to end. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Before I go, will you explain to me what the orthogonal bet is? Those are
Sure.
two worlds that I think I know the meaning of, but I don't know what they mean when you put them together.
Yeah. So the idea behind it is, so orthogonal is kind of like perpendicular, kind of like going off in a different direction than what you would normally do. And so orthogonal bets in kind of the investment world are making bets that are kind of different than what everyone else is thinking. And so in terms of the orthogonal bet for this podcast, the idea is that rather than focusing on all the things that everyone else is thinking about, like AI or crypto or whatever is kind of the theme of the moment, there is something to be said and something to be gained by just pursuing curiosity and having lots of interesting conversations and learning about lots of different things, because these could be useful stepping stones to learning about other things and maybe even making investments. I think, that being said, I'm not on the investment team for our firm, and so I have the flexibility to just pursue my curiosity wherever it kind of takes me. But yeah, that would be kind of the way to describe it.
Right. Fascinating. That explains what I'm doing here, because I'm very orthogonal and all of that.
Fantastic.